stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with a face carved by dueling scars. A voice that could fill a room without effort, and a presence that made even senior officers look away. When Heinrich Himmler needed someone to take command of the most feared security apparatus in the history of the Third Reich, he chose Ernst Kaltenbrunner. But what some historical accounts and declassified intelligence reports seem to suggest is that this choice may have come with consequences Himmler never fully anticipated. There are documents, interrogation records, and post-war testimonies that raise a question historians continue to examine. Did Himmler, the architect of the SS empire, eventually come to fear the very man he had elevated to run it? That question is not as simple as it might appear. And the answer, if there is one, may lie not in dramatic confrontations, but in something far more bureaucratic, far more calculated, and in many ways, far more disturbing. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was born on October 4th, 1903, in Reinhard, a modest town in Upper Austria that was, at the time, still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family belonged to the educated middle class. His father was a lawyer, and the household carried the kind of civic respectability that came with legal credentials and stable income. This background is worth noting because Kaltenbrunner's path toward radical politics was not one driven by poverty or desperation. It appears to have been a choice shaped instead by the ideological currents that swept through Central Europe in the aftermath of the First World War. When the Habsburg monarchy collapsed in 1918, then Austria was left as a truncated republic with an uncertain identity. Pan-German nationalism, anti-Marxist sentiment, and a deep nostalgia for a unified German-speaking world spread rapidly through student circles and political clubs. The young Kaltenbrunner, who went on to study law at the Karl Franzens University in Graz in the early 1920s, entered this environment at precisely the moment when it was becoming most volatile. Graz in that era was something of a political cauldron. The city had long been a stronghold of German nationalist sentiment, and the university was no exception. Student fraternities with pan-German leanings flourished, and the ritualized dueling culture that produced the facial scars Kaltenbrunner would carry for the rest of his life was part of this world. These scars, visible reminders of the Menser tradition practiced in German-speaking student associations, became a permanent feature of his appearance and a mark of social belonging in certain circles. What the available records seem to indicate is that Kaltenbrunner's radicalization during this period was gradual rather than sudden. He completed his legal training and was admitted to the bar, presenting the outward profile of a respectable professional. But by 1930, he had joined the Austrian branch of the National Socialist German Workers' Party at a time when membership in that organization in Austria was not merely controversial, but genuinely dangerous. The Austrian government viewed the organization with increasing alarm, and those who openly affiliated with it risked their careers and their freedom. 1 year later, in 1931, Kaltenbrunner joined the Schutzstaffel, the SS, the organization that Himmler was in the process of transforming from a personal bodyguard unit into what would become the ideological and coercive spine of the Nazi state. The Austrian SS at this point was still small, operating in the shadows of a government that had not yet been brought into alignment with Berlin. To join was to accept a level of personal risk that separated those with genuine commitment from those with merely passing sympathies. The Austrian government under Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss moved to ban the National Socialist German Workers' Party outright in 1933, which pushed all of its affiliated structures, including the SS, into clandestine operation. Kaltenbrunner became one of the key organizers of this underground network in Upper Austria and Linz. He recruited. He maintained communications with the party leadership in Germany, and he worked to sustain the organizational coherence of a movement that was being actively suppressed. He was arrested multiple times during this period. These were not symbolic detentions. They involved interrogations, searches, and the very real possibility of extended imprisonment. In January 1935, he was sentenced to several months in custody for illegal political activities. What is noteworthy, from an analytical standpoint, is that each arrest appears to have reinforced rather than diminished his standing within the underground movement. He was seen as someone willing to bear personal consequences for his organizational loyalty, which was precisely the kind of character the SS rewarded. The failed coup attempt of July 25, 1934, in which SS and Sturmabteilung operatives assassinated Chancellor Dollfuss but failed to seize power, marked a turning point for Austrian National Socialists. The aftermath brought severe repression and a crackdown that scattered much of the movement. Kaltenbrunner survived this period, and some historians suggest that his legal training gave him a certain advantage in navigating interrogations without providing prosecutors with the evidence they needed for a more serious conviction. Through the mid-1930s, Kaltenbrunner consolidated his position within the Austrian SS hierarchy. He built a reputation not as an ideological theorist, but as an administrator and enforcer. He was, by most accounts, less interested in the philosophical dimensions of National Socialist doctrine than in the mechanics of power and control. This pragmatic orientation would define his entire career. The Anschluss of March 1938, the absorption of Austria into the German Reich, transformed his circumstances overnight. Kaltenbrunner moved from the underground into official positions almost immediately. He was appointed State Secretary for Security in Vienna and simultaneously became the higher SS and police leader for the Danube region, placing him in command of the security apparatus for all of the formerly Austrian territories now integrated into the Reich. His performance in this role brought him to the attention of senior figures in Berlin. He demonstrated an ability to coordinate police, intelligence, and administrative functions across a large and newly incorporated territory. He was promoted steadily within the SS hierarchy, reaching the rank of Obergruppenführer. Then came January 1943, and the event that would define the rest of his life. Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Main Security Office, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, had been assassinated by Czech and Slovak resistance fighters in Prague in May 1942. Heydrich had been one of the most feared men in the Third Reich, and his death left a vacuum at the apex of the security structure that was not easily filled. Himmler spent months searching for a successor. What he appears to have wanted was someone capable enough to manage the operational complexity of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt without being so politically capable that they would become a threat to his own position. Kaltenbrunner was appointed Chief of the Security Police and the Security Service in January 1943. He now controlled an empire that included the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police commonly known as the Gestapo, the Kriminalpolizei, the Criminal Police, the Security Service's foreign intelligence operations, and a range of other functions tied to internal security, surveillance, and the enforcement of political conformity across occupied Europe and the Reich itself. This was not an administrative role in any ordinary sense. The Reichssicherheitshauptamt at this stage of the war was deeply embedded in the machinery of the final solution, coordinating deportations, managing the flow of intelligence about resistance movements, overseeing prisoner classification systems, and maintaining the internal security infrastructure of a state that was simultaneously fighting a world war and conducting industrial-scale mass murder. What makes Kaltenbrunner's tenure analytically complex is the question of how much direct knowledge and operational control he exercised over these functions, versus how much was managed by subordinates who had built their own power bases under Heydrich. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Gestapo, was one such figure. Walter Schellenberg, who ran foreign intelligence operations, was another. These men had been in place for years and had developed considerable bureaucratic autonomy. Kaltenbrunner came in as an outsider in some respects, without the Berlin connections and institutional history that Heydrich had possessed. And yet the documentary record, as it was assembled by prosecutors at the Nuremberg tribunal and has been examined by historians since, suggests that Kaltenbrunner was far from a passive figurehead. There are directives bearing his signature or his initialing that touch on prisoner treatment, deportation coordination, and intelligence operations. His claim, made consistently throughout his trial, that he was essentially a legal advisor with limited operational authority was directly contested by these documents. The question of what Himmler feared in Kaltenbrunner requires some unpacking. Some accounts, including post-war testimonies from figures like Walter Schellenberg, suggest that Himmler grew increasingly uncomfortable with Kaltenbrunner's access to information and his growing network of direct relationships with Hitler. Himmler had positioned himself as the indispensable intermediary between Hitler and the SS, and a subordinate who developed independent lines of communication to the top threatened that intermediary role. There is also the matter of temperament. Kaltenbrunner was blunt, physically imposing, and capable of a directness that made those around him uncomfortable. Some accounts describe him as someone who drank heavily and carried his authority with an aggressive confidence that was not always easy for others, including his nominal superiors, to manage. Whether this translated into anything Himmler could specifically identify as a structural threat to his own position, or whether it was simply a personality friction that made their relationship tense, is something historians continue to debate without a clear consensus. What seems clearer is that by the final years of the war, Kaltenbrunner had become deeply embedded in the operational core of the regime in ways that went beyond his formal appointment. He maintained contact with Hitler directly and was involved in discussions about internal security and the handling of prisoners that reached the highest levels of decision-making within the rapidly deteriorating Nazi state. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1944 and into 1945, Kaltenbrunner's responsibilities did not diminish. The internal security functions of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt became more intense as the regime dealt with military setbacks and growing resistance movements in occupied territories. The events following the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler placed enormous pressure on the entire security apparatus. And Kaltenbrunner was directly involved in the investigations and prosecutions that followed. By the spring of 1945, with Soviet forces closing on Berlin from the east and American and British forces advancing from the west, Kaltenbrunner relocated to the Austrian Alps. Declassified intelligence reports, including documents released by the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1990s, reconstruct his movements during these final weeks. He operated from mountain retreats in the Alta See region, continuing to issue directives to remaining Reichssicherheitshauptamt units, and according to some accounts, exploring the possibility of negotiating some form of arrangement with Western forces. Though historians generally regard these efforts as vague and unrealistic, Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Kaltenbrunner remained in hiding for 4 more days. On May 12th, agents of the American Counterintelligence Corps located him in a mountain cabin near Alta See. He presented himself as a physician and gave a false name. The deception lasted only briefly. 2 women who had connections to him recognized him when he was brought into town. His identity was confirmed, and he was arrested immediately. At the Nuremberg tribunal, which began proceedings in late 1945, Kaltenbrunner was the highest-ranking SS officer in the dock. He entered the proceedings with a consistent defensive strategy. He acknowledged his formal title while disputing that he had exercised meaningful operational control over the specific functions that constituted the charges against him. He argued that the Gestapo was managed by Müller, that the camps were outside his authority, that documents bearing his name had been signed without his full understanding of their contents or by others acting in his name. The prosecution countered with the archival record, documents with his signature or annotations in his handwriting, testimony from former subordinates describing meetings he had chaired, reports detailing policy decisions that bore his institutional fingerprint. The tribunal concluded that the weight of this evidence demonstrated that Kaltenbrunner had exercised substantial administrative authority over the security apparatus, and that his claims of limited involvement were not supported by the documentary record. On October 1st, 1946, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. 16 days later, on October 16th, he was executed by hanging in Nuremberg. His remains were cremated and his ashes scattered in a river to prevent any site from becoming a focal point for commemoration. What Kaltenbrunner's case seems to illuminate, when examined through the lens of the available historical evidence, is the way in which bureaucratic systems of enormous scale can distribute and obscure responsibility, while still depending on individual actors at key positions to function. He was not the architect of the system he inherited. He did not design the Reichssicherheitshauptamt or the concentration camp network or the deportation apparatus. But the evidence suggests that he occupied a position of genuine authority within that system, that he exercised functions that contributed to its operation at a critical stage, and that his post-war effort to present himself as a marginal figure was not, in the end, consistent with what the documents showed. The question of whether Himmler feared him remains open to interpretation. What is perhaps less speculative is that the system Kaltenbrunner ran was one in which fear itself was a primary instrument of governance. The irony, if it can be called that, is that the man who presided over this architecture of fear ended his life in a courtroom, where the records he had generated were turned against him. The story of Ernst Kaltenbrunner seems to resist easy categorization. He was not a fanatic in the theatrical sense, not a man whose ideology burned visibly on the surface. What the historical record appears to suggest carefully and with appropriate caution is something perhaps more unsettling. A figure defined less by passion than by a calculated willingness to function within a system that required him to ask very few questions about what that functioning made possible. If this analysis raised questions you had not considered before, the evidence and the debates around figures like Kaltenbrunner are far from exhausted. There is more to examine, more to understand, and more context that changes the picture. Hit the like button if this kind of deep historical analysis is what you come here for. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The next subject may surprise you even more.